from the ashes, you have broken every curse. Blessed Redeemer, you have set this captive free. Lord, I can't help but sing. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. I will rest in your promises. My confidence is your faithfulness. Faithful you are, faithful forever you will be. Faithful you are. All your promises are yes and amen. All your promises are yes and amen. Who am I that the highest King would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me. His grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me. Yes, he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Oh, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, is free indeed. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God. Yes, I am.
As we continue our study in the book of Acts chapter 7, one of the things that we're noticing is that Stephen, though he is under a lot of pressure, the council has gathered together, drug him before them, and the chief priest has said in the first verse, "Are these things so?" Stephen is not interested in defending himself. Rather, he is interested in defending Jesus or sharing the message of Jesus. So the accusation at the end of chapter 6, what they've drug him up, the charges that they've drug him up on have been he's blaspheming against Moses and against this holy place, against the temple and all that it represents. From the Jewish leaders, the temple represents Judaism, the law of Moses, their religion, their way of life. What the temple is supposed to be is the presence of God among his people and the place where they come to connect with him. That's the problem. It's all gotten askew that it is no longer about God and about being in his presence, but it's about their law, their religion, their positions, and so on. That's the very thing that Stephen is addressing. So under the charge of that he is blaspheming against Moses, in his summary of the Old Testament, in his showing them how God has been working from Abraham until Jesus, Stephen is really going to spend the most time with Moses as the central figure of their faith. That's what they have made their faith about, Moses. So that's where he is speaking. Now, what's fascinating, you can see that Stephen is trying to reach them. He's not trying to merely disagree with them or to attack them back, but rather to find common ground. So he started off with our fathers or brethren and fathers. So there's common connection and respect. And then our fathers, the patriarchs. And then he'll spend a lot of time on Moses and the commonality they have around him. Now, when we get to the end of the chapter, when we get to verse 51 and following, when he gets to application, it's going to get rough. It's going to get direct, and he's going to talk about your fathers. So he starts with our fathers in terms of their common faith, but he's going to get to your fathers where their faith has diverged or where there is a difference and where it matters. So we're in the middle of his discussion of Moses or connection with Moses down through the first 29 verses. He's reminding them of what they know very well. He's not covering all the details, but is summarizing. But we have noticed a unique thing or two along the way. For example, we've noticed by inspiration of the Holy Spirit that Stephen said Moses was powerful in words and deeds, which sheds some light in what we noticed in the book of Exodus following Moses and how God uses him. When Moses flees into the wilderness, you see Stephen point out in verse 29, at this remark Moses fled and became an alien in the land of Midian, where he became the father of 2 sons, which is another way, as he says in verse 30, after 40 years had passed. The fact that Moses has 2 sons is just not an incidental, but rather how he is an alien, and yet he is settled enough to find a wife, he's settled enough to have children, that this idea of being an alien in a foreign land has really become, as far as Moses knew, a permanent residence. So 40 years of being trained in the palace of Pharaoh, and then 40 years of being trained as a shepherd. So we mentioned at the close of our discussion in the previous lesson that what an interesting thing that we could have well understood his time in the wilderness as a time of banishment or a punishment or of waste. Because all those years of training, being powerful in word and in deed, wasted as a shepherd, wasted out in the wilderness. No opportunity to practice his oratory skills, his presentation ability, no real way to practice his strength of deeds as a trained warrior, leader, etc. But you see, there's another element. There is power in his words and deeds, but there needs to be power in his faith. Moses will not succeed because he is so amazing. Moses can only succeed when he learns that God is so amazing. So there is that personal development, that raw material that we see in Moses, his willingness to intervene where he sees an injustice. whether it's the Egyptian taskmaster, whether it is the two Hebrews that are fighting, whether it's the shepherds that have kept the daughters of Jethro from the well, and any other example. So that same character, not that God is a part of injustice, but we'll watch Moses try to intervene when his sister Miriam is being punished for her own rebellion. He will intervene when God says, I'm going to wipe out all these people and I'm going to start over with you, Moses. He will step between God, or the wrath of God, and the just punishment upon God's people. So Moses' character is a man who will step between or intervene where people are going to suffer, whether it is just or unjust. It's what Moses does. And God is going to use that strength of character once there's been 40 years of tempering in the wilderness. Now, that's always an interesting point. That's not really where Stephen is emphasizing, but I find it important or encouraging or fascinating because most of us don't like being in the wilderness. Most of us, all right, if we've got to go through experience, a day or two or a week or two is sufficient, but 40 years? To be 80 years old before we can do something useful? The whole concept of God's timing is for us often so challenging. Perhaps that's part of what Stephen is suggesting in verse 17 when he talks about as the time of the promise was approaching. Not the time of our expectations or the calendar or whatever else we might be thinking, but it's the time of the promise that God knows that we don't. So by the end of verse 29, Moses is a settled resident alien. I would guess after 40 years he has given up on whatever he thought he was going to accomplish in his younger life, because we noticed in the intervention in verse 23, it entered his mind to visit his brethren, and then the emphasis seems to be that they did not recognize that he had come to deliver them. Because verse 25, he had supposed his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him, but they did not understand. The lesson that has to be learned by Moses and by the Israelites is that the deliverance will come through God. Moses may be an instrument or a servant, but it's God who delivers. It's God who provides. Later earlier in the Gospels, as Jesus is feeding the multitude, when they're fed, they're like, well, this is great. You know, Moses fed our fathers in the wilderness for 40 years. No, really, Moses didn't feed the Israelites manna from heaven. God fed them with manna from heaven. So that's the problem here, is they're focused on Moses and on the temple, that it's about them. It's all gotten twisted around, and Stephen's trying to show them, you've got to untwist that, untangle that, where it's back to what God is doing. So in verse 30, there's a quick phrase, after 40 years had passed. Simply stated, that's a lot of living in 40 years. After 40 years had passed, an angel appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai in the flame of a burning thorn bush. When Moses saw it, he marveled at the sight, and as he approached to look more closely, there came the voice of the Lord. So God has drawn his attention. I always think that's kind of an interesting detail. God could have just spoken to him right where he was, but rather God appears in the burning bush to draw Moses to him, as if this is the practice, that we need to be drawn to him and that we need to be aware of his presence. Because in verse 32, the voice of the Lord speaks, I am the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Moses shook with fear and would not venture to look. So Moses stops once there is awareness of God. And it would seem, it's been a long time, that there seems to be some part of Moses in his being raised up and his understanding of his difference, that he's not an Egyptian, but that he is one of the only and very few and rare Egyptian men of his age, because the rest of his brethren was thrown into the rivers, little boys, but he alone was spared. There seems to be in Moses then an awareness of why that is, because what we noticed again back in verse 25, and he supposed that his brethren understood that God was granting them deliverance through him. So he knew. This is the second kind of insightful thing. Not only was he a man of powerful words, so this "I can't speak well" in Exodus was an excuse, but that he already knew at the age of 40, already knew in Pharaoh's house that he was to be the deliverer. So that says a lot, that we can only try to understand or imagine or guess between the lines. But what that's like to grow up in Pharaoh's house, watching the oppression of the Hebrews, knowing you're a Hebrew, not an Egyptian, believing that you are the deliverer, and so you make the attempt and fail miserably as he makes that attempt in his own strength and according to his own will. And then to spend 40 years in the wilderness, what an opposite and different, almost like, is it a time to forget? Is it a time to have his identity completely changed? 40 years of shepherding. So now that God has spoken to him after a long 4 decades, Moses shakes with fear, verse 33, but the Lord said to him, "Take off the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground." God didn't appear to him, as far as on him or at his spot, rather he appears slightly to the side and then invites Moses into his presence, that Moses would seek him. Verse 34 he continues, "I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt, and have heard their groans, and I have come down to rescue them. Come now, and I will send you to Egypt." There's some key ideas here that are important and different. These are God's people, not Moses's. God has heard, and God will rescue. I have come down to rescue them. Now I'm going to send you to Egypt. So there's a very different focal point now in Moses' life. And remember, Stephen is striving for his audience to hear the difference. They are invested in their position and their work, and it's their temple, and it's a religion that they administer. And in so doing, they've gotten so clouded by internal vision or perspective that they're not seeing God. Because we marvel, we wonder, how do you see the miracles of Jesus? And now in Acts, how do you see the miracles that the apostles are doing, and at a minimum not rejoice in how lives are being blessed, but rather they're offended by the ruckus that's being created in their temple? This is out of line. This is inappropriate. As we noticed with Jesus cleansing the temple, and now we're right back to it with Acts chapter 5, a man being healed who was lame outside the temple, and now he's celebrating, and everyone else gets caught up in the healings that go on in the temple and the people's lives being changed and all of that. So we marveled at, how do you get to a place where all you can see is, hey, this is a ruckus, this is inappropriate, things have to go a certain way, our way. Well, it's the same problem that Moses had, that he had supposed that he would be the deliverer, and they have supposed that it is their religion, or that it is through them that people must go in order to have a relationship with God. Once Stephen gets them to Moses' launching, if you will, in this mission after 80 years, 40 years of training in Pharaoh's house, 40 years of training in the wilderness. Verse 35, his language changes, and he uses this expression a lot now over the next few verses when he says, "This Moses whom they disowned." This Moses whom they disowned. There's some parallels here. Already they've heard from Peter and John, this Jesus that you have disowned, or in Acts chapter 2, this Jesus whom you have crucified. And so now we're moving to the application, or we're moving to the conclusion or the call to action or to repentance. So the original charge in chapter 6 is they are blaspheming against Moses and this place, this temple. And so now Stephen begins to say, this Moses, whom they disowned, reaching back to that comment between the two Hebrews when Moses tried to intervene between fellow Hebrews, one hurting another. When the one doing the oppression or the hurting said, "Who made you ruler and judge?" So he was rejected. I mean, just hearing the echoes in 1 Peter chapter 2, this Jesus or in Acts 2, whom you crucified, or in 1 Peter chapter 2, this cornerstone whom the builders rejected, God has made him the cornerstone, and everything is built upon him. This Moses, whom they disowned, saying, who made you ruler and judge, is the one whom God sent to be a ruler and a deliverer with the help of the angel who appeared to him in the thorn bush. I don't want to get distracted, but there's so many fascinating tidbits is not the right word, insights into the original text, because the voice speaking from the bush says that he is Yahweh, that he is God, and yet here Stephen says he's the angel that appeared, and you do have that comment in Exodus chapter 3 that there's the angel of the Lord. And so, one of the things that's the undertone here, or one of the insights here, is it's all pointing to this voice being Jesus, this messenger in the bush, which they should have picked up on, or at least there was the hint of that for them to connect. Just some amazing insights along the way about Moses and about God and about, of course, Jesus. Verse 36, second time, this man. So this Moses that they rejected, this man led them out, performing wonders and signs in the land of Egypt and in the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. The Bible has some interesting ways to signal things. Moses is in Pharaoh's house for 40 years. He's in his own wilderness for 40 years. And then the Israelites, by their own lack of faith, are in their wilderness for 40 years. We could talk about 40 days and 40 nights of rain in Genesis. We could talk about the 40 days and 40 nights of Jesus as being hungry in the temptation in Matthew chapter 3. There's just a way that God says, pay attention to this. It's a time of challenge, of growth, of renewal. That 40 seems to be a number that says there's going to be change here, whether it's the change that happens to the earth because of 40 days and 40 nights of rain, Moses' own personal change, the Israelites' time of change, and so on. This man led them out. So this Moses that has been rejected keeps coming back. It keeps being true that he's the one that they should have listened to. He's the one that God is using. Verse 37, he does it again. So verse to verse to verse. This is the Moses. You know, the one that was rejected. You know, the one that was leading them for 40 years. This is the Moses who said to the sons of Israel, God will raise up for you a prophet like me from your brethren. We're getting to Jesus. There's been the insight, there's been the hints, there's been the parallels, but now Stephen specifically reminds them that Moses prophesied someone would come like him, that it was never only and always about Moses. That all of this that they're doing, this law of Moses, this temple worship, is never intended to be permanent, but to proceed or to bring them to Jesus. The ultimate promise, the one that they should be waiting for and looking for. They need to make a decision, they have made, but they need to make a faith decision about this Jesus and all that's been going on. So for the fourth time in so many verses, in verse 38, this is the one who was in the congregation in the wilderness together with the angel who was speaking to him on Mount Sinai. We had the angel in the burning bush. We have the angel on Mount Sinai. For fun, run over to 1 Corinthians chapter. Well, let's just take a quick ricochet. Can we do that? Another one of these distractions, but wonderful connections. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul does something sort of parallel in the opening verse when he says, for I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers, there's that same kind of conversation and connection, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ. God's redemptive work from the garden to the cross. The great and amazing work of God in the Exodus is the work of redemption through Christ, which is what Stephen is doing, is connecting the dots for them that they've refused to do. So their big thing was, hey, you were in opposition to Moses. And so now Stephen's saying, you know that Moses? You know the same Moses? You know the Moses in the wilderness? You know Moses? Really beginning to make the connection for them to bring them to a point of decision and a moment of faith. So verse 38, again, we're back in Acts. This is the one who was in the congregation of the wilderness, together with the angel, because without the angel, Moses is nothing. Without God, Moses is nothing. Without God leading them, providing for them, parting the Red Sea, defeating the Egyptians, giving them manna from heaven, water from a rock, their clothes don't wear out. This is all about God's work through Moses. And that's the point where they seem to have stopped or have lost that connection. So in the middle of verse 38, who was speaking with him on Mount Sinai and who was with our fathers, and he received living oracles to pass on to you. They're connected in this. Moses' story is their story. Verse 39, our fathers. Eventually he'll get to your fathers, but it's still our fathers were unwilling to be obedient to him, but repudiated him, and in their hearts turned back to Egypt. So you're blaspheming against Moses. All right, let's talk about Moses. Let's do a little setup. Let's remind ourselves who Moses is, how he came to be Moses, what his point was. But let's remind ourselves that though Moses was, this Moses that you are revering, this Moses that, it almost sounds like you spend more time worshiping Moses than God. But all right, let's take your frame of reference. Let's connect with where you're coming from. And let's talk about Moses. Do you remember how Moses, though he was prepared by God for this moment, was rejected by his own Hebrew brethren? This Moses that was with him in the wilderness for 40 years, this Moses that was rejected by those in the wilderness who were there with him, and he's moved over the fact that even when Moses first came and spoke to Pharaoh and to his fellow Hebrews, they kept, who are you and why are you here? And you've made things worse. That they constantly rejected Moses even before they were brought out of Egypt to the desert on the way to the promised land. So the story of Moses is the story of the Israelites rejecting God through rejecting the servant that God has sent. Moses was the great deliverer sent by God who was regularly rejected by God's people. That's the story of Moses, which is exactly the parallel with Jesus, which is where he'll eventually take them to. So he's reminding them, verse 39, our fathers were unwilling to be obedient. They weren't when it was just two Hebrews struggling, and they're not even in the wilderness, which is the 40 years. All right, so they've already been through the 10 plagues. They've already been through crossing the Red Sea, parted on their behalf. They've already witnessed the pillar of fire by night and the pillar of cloud by day. They've already witnessed the protection from and then the destruction of the Egyptian army. They have witnessed the water from a rock, the manna from heaven, the quail from the sea, the protection from other nations, the fact that their clothes don't wear out. And still they rejected Moses. They repudiated, they dismissed him, they dishonored him because, he says, in their hearts they had turned back to Egypt. One of the most fascinating and frustrating accounts in the book of Exodus is every time they run across some new faith challenge, it's, we wish we were back in Egypt. Because in their hearts they had turned back. Their hearts had turned to pillars of salt. Like Lot's wife, they had looked back longingly. One of the weird things that they say is, at least, are there not enough graves in Egypt? We've come out here to die. Back in Egypt we had such good food. And they keep talking about we had leeks. That's one of the lists, which is like kind of like a wild onion. And you read through Exodus and you're like, can leeks really be that good? How do you get to a place where you forget? Yeah, that meal we were eating is while we were slaves. It was what was doled out to us by the cruel masters, that is, the Egyptians. How does that suddenly become romanticized to be, boy, those were the good old days? You know, back when we were enslaved, crying out for deliverance for 400 years? How does that happen? Well, it happens when their hearts are turned back to Egypt, when they have refused to be obedient. And where we're headed is, how do you reject Jesus? How do you look at the miracles performed in the temple by the apostles? How do you look at changed lives and not say, God is among us, praise be to God, this is the best day of my life? How does that happen? Well, the same way it happened to Moses. So they bring up Moses. Stephen's like, all right, let's talk about Moses. They turned in their hearts back to Egypt. In fact, it's so egregious. Verse 40, saying to Aaron, make for us gods who will go before us. For this Moses who led us out of the land of Egypt, we don't know what's happened to him. They reject every chance they can. They push Moses away every opportunity. Sometimes we read through the Gospels and we wonder, wow, how does Judas betray Jesus? How does he do that? I mean, after all, according to Matthew chapter 10, he's one of the 12 that's given the ability to even do miraculous healings as well. And they're seeing Jesus, Judas is seeing Jesus, hearing Jesus. How do you get there? Well, when you read through the Gospel of John, you find out, for example, in chapter 13 that he is betraying him. It's an ongoing thing, that he is about wanting to sell this perfume that was offered at and on Jesus' feet. We could have sold that, given money to the poor, because he keeps the money box, because he's embezzling out of it, which means the whole time he never gives his heart to Jesus. If you're embezzling, stealing, taking some money out of the box, then you've held back a significant part. You've not fully given yourself to Jesus. He was betraying him, this ongoing thing. Well, how do these people in the wilderness act like this? Because they never really give their heart to God. They hold back. Why is it that as soon as Moses is out of sight, out of mind, they immediately reject him? How is it in verse 41, at that time they made a calf and brought a sacrifice to the idol and rejoicing in the works of their hands? How does that happen so quickly that they could reject the God of heaven, who's given them, who's brought the 10 plagues, part of the Red Sea, given them manna, all the things we've already mentioned? How do you do that? Because their heart was never wholly given to God. In fact, here's another time when Stephen gives some stunning insight into this account that we know so well. So we know how, while Moses is tarrying on the mountain, receiving the 10 commandments and more, that they go to Aaron, you got to make us a golden calf and an idol. And so Aaron does. They fall down and worship. How do you worship an idol when you're at the foot of the mountain covered by smoke and fire, where Moses is receiving the law from God's presence? How do you do that? Because the way we do that is when we never fully, wholly give our heart to God. Verse 42, so they're rejoicing at the work of their hands, but God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven. There's a lot there. There is a series of study that we have recorded on living a spirit-filled, spirit-led life, and then part of that conversation is about how does satanic influence and forces invade our lives, and how do we deal with it? For this is truly spiritual warfare. God surrenders them, gives them up, delivers them to serve the host of heaven, much like you see in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul teaches them to deliver this man over to Satan, who is involved in immorality with his own mother. The concept there is, if we experience such evil, perhaps that last and final form of discipline would cause us to finally wake up to say, this is not where I want to be. That's what God does here. Because what's going on? How do we understand? How can we understand how they could do something like this? It's not the leaks. It's not how the food in Egypt was just so mesmerizing and captivating. But when they left Egypt, Stephen reminds them of what they also know from the Old Testament prophets. But God turned away and delivered them up to serve the host of heaven. As it is written in the book of the prophets, it was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices 40 years in the wilderness. Was it, O house of Israel? We're familiar from Exodus with the murmurings that go on in the wilderness, and at every turn they're always weak in faith. Now we understand why. The whole time they're in the wilderness, they are involved in idolatry. They are continuing to serve the false gods that they were serving in Egypt. The rescue that God is undertaking is not only from the oppressive hand of the Egyptians, but from the oppressive hands or hand of Satan, or the darkness of idolatry. They are not a faithful nation in Egypt, which says a lot about the grace of God. He doesn't rescue them from Egypt because they're such a pious, righteous, and holy people. He rescues them because of a promise he made to Abraham. That doesn't mean everybody in Israel is evil, but it does help us understand why they have such struggles in the wilderness, and also why, by the wisdom of God and the grace of God, that it was important that they not be led directly to the promised land and then released to their own devices. They're not ready for that. They need the 40 years in the wilderness in the same way that Moses did. Moses needed to be set free from his own idolatry of self-reliance and internal or personal strength. The Israelites needed 40 years to be cleansed of idolatry. Sadly, that means that none of the generation that left Egypt will enter the promised land. But it will set free their children from idolatry. It will allow them to be cleansed from the evil and dark influences that they have lived under in Egypt. Verse 43, he continues to remind them, you also took along the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of the god Rompha, the images which you made to worship. I will remove you beyond Babylon. This would be interesting to know more about. It was not to me that you offered victims and sacrifices. Well, the traditional worship of Moloch in verse 23 involves infant sacrifice, involves offering infant children up to see them burned alive in the fires of the sacrifice to Moloch. How is that going on in the wilderness? Stephen gives us tremendous insight into why they fall in the wilderness and why you have the murmuring and why you have the rejection of Moses, because their hearts have been darkened and poisoned by such idolatry. Ooh, we're getting close now. Why is it that Jesus is being rejected? Why is it that the chief priests, the scribes, the Pharisees, the court of the Sanhedrin, why is it that they will not accept the truth of the gospel? Why is it they can't even hold on 3 paragraphs from Gamaliel's counsel about why don't we just wait and see if this is of God? Why can they not do that? Ooh, we're getting to the application and the challenge in our own lives. We've got one more paragraph of our fathers before we're going to move to your fathers, beginning in verse 51. The darkness of idolatry, the darkness of holding back and not surrendering all to Christ allows Satan to have a foothold, and the difference that it makes. So the charge was blasphemy against Moses. Stephen's getting down to it. This Moses, this one. This is the one. You know Moses? All right, you brought up Moses. Let's talk about Moses. What was the problem? What was the challenge that Moses had to face? Why was Moses rejected? It's the same problem. Idolatry. is allowing anyone or anything to be the most important in our lives above God. We often think about idolatry as this kind of thing. Well, they've got some kind of carved out rock or wood picture or figure in their house and they kneel down before that, and we all know that's ridiculous. Idolatry is about whatever's first. An examination of our time, our money, our energy, are ways to determine who is really or what is really first in our life. Who do we serve? Who is first? Is it God? Or is it anything else? We must not allow Satan to have a foothold by holding back anything from God, that we might experience the life that God intends. What's first in your life?
The ground began to shake. The stone was rolled away. His perfect love could not be overcome. Now death, where is your sting? Our resurrected King has rendered you defeated. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. We sing hallelujah. The Lamb is overcome. Forever He is glorified. Forever He is lifted high. Forever He is risen. He is alive. He is alive.